What if the loudest gunshots in Beijing were never meant for the public to hear? In the early hours of a winter night, as Beijing slept under an illusion of absolute control, reports began to circulate of violence inside one of the most secretive compounds in China's capital. The Jingxi Hotel, normally a silent nerve center for closed-door military meetings, suddenly became the focal point of whispers about betrayal, emergency evacuations, and a regime scrambling to contain panic. If power in China is designed to look immovable, why did it appear even briefly to fracture from within? So what really happened that night? And why did Beijing move so fast to seal it off from the world? According to fragments pieced together by open-source analysts and cautiously worded reporting in Western media, the incident was not a street protest or an external attack, but an internal rupture. The Jingxi Hotel is no ordinary venue. It functions as a secure decision-making hub where senior military figures and party elites meet away from cameras, diplomats, and even most of the Communist Party bureaucracy. Any disturbance there immediately signals danger at the very top of the system. On that night, conflicting reports suggested a violent confrontation between elite security units assigned to protect the top leadership and another armed element operating under internal military authority. Beijing's response was instant and unmistakable. Roads around the western districts were sealed. Communications in parts of the capital went dark. Military vehicles appeared in positions that suggested contingency planning, not routine security. Within hours, the information environment was flooded with silence, rather than clarification. For analysts, this silence was the loudest signal of all. China's political system is built on the projection of unity. Public crises are normally reframed as administrative adjustments or anti-corruption measures. Yet this time, the speed and scale of the lockdown hinted at something more severe, a breach of trust inside the military chain of command. When loyalty is the currency of survival, even a rumor of defection becomes existential. The timing of the incident amplified its impact. As Donald Trump, now back in the White House, pushes a harder line on strategic competition with Beijing, Chinese leadership is under pressure on multiple fronts. NATO has deepened coordination with Indo-Pacific partners. Ukraine, backed by Western intelligence and weapons, has intensified strikes on Russian energy infrastructure moves that indirectly strain Beijing's quiet support networks for Moscow. Against this backdrop, instability at home is not merely embarrassing, it is dangerous. Western defense analysts note that China's leadership has spent the past decade consolidating power precisely to avoid this scenario. Senior officers were promoted less for battlefield experience than for political reliability. Entire branches of the military were reshuffled under the banner of reform. Yet paradoxically, that very concentration of power may have increased the system's fragility. When authority narrows, any internal shock travels faster and hits harder. What makes the Jingxi episode particularly unsettling is not the violence itself, but what it implies about command and control. Even the suggestion that armed units could clash inside a restricted leadership zone forces uncomfortable questions. Who gave the orders? Who hesitated, and who realized, perhaps too late, that loyalty was no longer universal? NATO planners quietly watch these signals. A China distracted by internal security fears is a China less able to project confidence abroad. At the same time, uncertainty raises risks. History shows that regimes facing internal doubt sometimes compensate with external assertiveness. In Washington and Brussels, strategists debate which path Beijing is more likely to take. For now, the official narrative remains unchanged. Nothing extraordinary occurred, and stability prevails. Yet the shadows around the Jingxi Hotel tell a different story. One of a leadership suddenly reminded that power, once centralized, becomes vulnerable to a single crack. Meanwhile, as Beijing worked to suppress the echoes of that night, attention quietly shifted to the figures rumored to be at the center of the storm and the betrayal that may have shaken the Red Palace from within. If the chaos at the Jingxi Hotel exposed a crack, the names emerging from behind that silence revealed where the structure was weakest. Within hours of the lockdown, Western intelligence briefings began circulating a familiar pattern. When Beijing refuses to confirm identities, it is usually because those identities sit dangerously close to the core of power. This was not an outsider's challenge. It was, by all credible indications, a confrontation among insiders, men who had risen precisely because they were once trusted. Could the most serious threat to China's leadership be coming from the very circle designed to protect it? At the center of the speculation stood senior military figures with direct access to strategic command structures. These were not provincial commanders or sidelined reformists. They were officers shaped by decades inside the system, promoted through loyalty, proximity, and political reliability. Their alleged involvement reframed the incident entirely. A street-level disturbance can be erased. A fracture among elite guardians cannot. According to reporting patterns familiar from past purges, the first official signals were deliberately vague. Disciplinary violations, organizational adjustments, and routine investigations appeared in controlled state language. Yet parallel to that script, analysts noted abrupt disappearances from public view. Scheduled appearances were canceled. Photographs vanished from official websites. Military communications tightened with phones confiscated and movement restricted inside key units. This is how betrayal is acknowledged in Beijing, never directly, but unmistakably. The logic behind such an internal rupture is critical to understand. For years, China's top leadership has operated under a doctrine of preventive loyalty enforcement. Promotions are rewards not for dissenting strategic thought, but for alignment. However, this approach carries a hidden cost. When strategic disagreement can no longer be expressed upward, it does not vanish. It mutates. It goes underground. Defense analysts in Europe and the United States increasingly argue that the pressure points are no longer ideological, but operational. As tensions over Taiwan intensified, and as China's indirect exposure to the Ukraine war deepened, particularly through Russia's reliance on Chinese components, some within the military reportedly questioned the sustainability of current policies. Not publicly, and not in policy papers, but in private networks of influence. The alleged slogan circulating in elite military circles, "Save the party to save the nation," is revealing. It echoes past internal crises in authoritarian systems, where challengers frame themselves not as rebels, but as guardians correcting a dangerous course. History shows this language is often used when loyalty to the leader conflicts with loyalty to the state. The betrayal, if that is what it was, appears to have been incomplete. Intelligence leaks suggest plans were exposed at the final stage, triggering the rapid security response seen in Beijing. From a systems perspective, this was not a failed coup in the classic sense. It was a stress test, and one that revealed how close the system came to losing control of its own inner perimeter. Western observers draw parallels to Cold War-era power struggles, where militaries under intense political pressure turned inward. NATO officials privately note that China's command structure is now operating under conditions of acute mistrust. Orders are followed, but confidence has eroded. And in military organizations, mistrust is corrosive. At the geopolitical level, this betrayal narrative intersects with a broader strategic moment. As Ukraine continues targeting Russian energy infrastructure, disrupting refineries, storage facilities, and logistics hubs, Moscow's dependence on Beijing quietly increases. Yet that dependency now carries risk. Any Chinese officer seen as too closely entangled with Russia's war effort becomes a liability under internal security scrutiny. For Xi's leadership, the lesson is brutal. Centralized power reduces ambiguity, but it also reduces resilience. When betrayal comes, it strikes vertically, not horizontally. The higher the trust, the deeper the damage. Yet, as loyalty collapsed at the top, a more unsettling question emerged. If trust inside the palace was gone, where could real authority now operate, from the halls of power or from somewhere far deeper underground? What does it mean when a leader retreats underground in his own capital? In authoritarian systems, symbolism matters as much as command authority, and few symbols are more revealing than physical location. As rumors spread that China's top leadership had activated emergency relocation protocols, analysts began focusing less on who had betrayed whom and more on where power itself had gone. If the palace was no longer secure, who was truly in control of China that night? Multiple intelligence assessments suggested that following the Jingxi incident, senior command functions were shifted away from their usual visible centers. While Beijing publicly projected calm satellite imagery and communications data indicated unusual activity in Western districts, long associated with hardened command infrastructure. These facilities are designed not for politics, but for survival, built to ensure continuity of government in scenarios ranging from internal unrest to nuclear conflict. The implication was stark. Leaders do not move into contingency bunkers lightly. Such a decision signals that the chain of command has been disrupted, that loyalty can no longer be assumed, and that information itself has become a threat. In military doctrine, relocation equals loss of confidence in surface-level control. Western experts on command and control systems note that once a leadership descends into hardened facilities, the nature of governance changes. Decision-making narrows. Advisors are filtered. Communication slows. What remains is not a confident projection of power, but a defensive posture focused on survival. This shift often marks the transition from political leadership to crisis management. At this moment, the global context matters. With Donald Trump back in office, U.S. intelligence posture toward China has sharpened. Surveillance coverage, cyber monitoring, and allied intelligence sharing, particularly with NATO partners, have intensified. Any sudden movement inside Beijing is immediately scrutinized, not just for what it reveals about China, but for how it might alter strategic calculations across multiple theaters. This is where the Ukraine war enters the picture. As Kyiv escalates precision strikes against Russian energy infrastructure using drones, long-range missiles, and Western-provided intelligence, the Kremlin's reliance on secure command resilience has become painfully obvious. Western analysts see a parallel risk emerging in China. A system built to project invulnerability becomes brittle when its leaders must physically hide to retain control. From NATO's perspective, a China operating from a bunker is a paradox. On one hand, it suggests restraint, a leadership too preoccupied with internal security to initiate major external adventures. On the other hand, history warns that bunker psychology can lead to miscalculation. Leaders isolated from dissenting voices may overestimate threats and underestimate consequences. Inside China's military, this transition reportedly deepened existing anxiety. Units accustomed to clear hierarchies faced a fog of uncertainty. Orders were issued, but with fewer signatures. Communication protocols tightened, slowing operational tempo. In modern warfare, hesitation is not neutral, it degrades capability. Strategists in Washington quietly debated a crucial question. Does internal instability make China less dangerous or more unpredictable? The answer depends on time. In the short term, internal consolidation absorbs energy and attention. In the medium term, unresolved mistrust corrodes effectiveness. In the long term, however, regimes sometimes seek external confrontation to restore internal cohesion. For now, the message from Beijing remained carefully scripted: stability, continuity, confidence. Yet beneath that messaging lay a transformed reality. Power was no longer flowing outward from visible institutions. It was being guarded, compressed, and shielded underground. What followed next shocked analysts. Even more evidence began to surface that the crisis was not only political, but strategic, touching the most sensitive layer of national security China possesses. If leadership relocation hinted at fear, the next wave of information suggested something far more destabilizing: the possible compromise of China's most sensitive military secrets. In Western intelligence circles, attention shifted rapidly from palace intrigue to strategic damage. This was no longer just about who lost influence, it was about what might have been lost to foreign eyes. Could China's nuclear deterrent have been exposed from within? Reports emerging through major Western outlets described an aggressive internal purge sweeping across the upper ranks of the armed forces. Officially, it was framed as a continuation of long-standing anti-corruption efforts. Unofficially, analysts recognized the familiar markers of a counter-mutiny. Senior officers vanished from public life. Entire command layers were placed under investigation. Thousands of personnel were reportedly detained or reassigned under emergency authority. What elevated this purge from political theater to strategic crisis were allegations tied to classified weapons programs. According to sources cited by Western journalists and defense analysts, investigators were examining whether sensitive data related to China's strategic missile forces had been compromised. This included guidance systems, launch protocols, and modernization pathways for intercontinental ballistic missiles, information that forms the backbone of nuclear deterrence. In deterrence theory, perception is everything. A nuclear force does not need to be destroyed to be weakened. It only needs to be understood. If an adversary believes it can anticipate or neutralize key systems, deterrence erodes. Even the suspicion of a leak forces costly recalibration. Redundancies must be rebuilt, procedures rewritten, trust reassessed. Western military experts emphasize that this kind of damage cannot be repaired quickly. Reconstituting confidence in strategic forces takes years, not months. Command chains must be revalidated, personnel re-cleared, entire doctrines quietly adjusted. During that process, readiness inevitably suffers. The timing again intersects with the broader war environment. As Ukraine continues to strike Russian refineries, storage depots, and export terminals, energy warfare has become a defining feature of modern conflict. These attacks, documented by Reuters and other outlets, are not merely tactical. They degrade state revenue, strain logistics, and expose vulnerabilities once considered secure. Analysts now see uncomfortable parallels. Internal leaks can cripple a nuclear posture just as effectively as drones cripple pipelines. For NATO planners, this convergence is telling. Authoritarian systems under pressure often face a double bind. Purges restore political control but degrade operational competence. Leniency preserves expertise but risks disloyalty. Beijing appears to have chosen control. The immediate military consequence is paralysis. Units hesitate, unsure which directives will later be judged as politically incorrect. Initiative disappears. Innovation stalls. The army becomes compliant but brittle. This has direct geopolitical implications. A China distracted by internal purges is less able to support partners abroad. It is also less credible as a long-term strategic counterweight. Western analysts argue that this moment weakens Beijing's negotiating position across multiple domains, from arms control signaling to crisis management in the Indo-Pacific. Yet there is a darker risk. When leaders believe their most sacred defenses have been compromised, paranoia intensifies. Decision-making narrows further. Errors become more likely. Meanwhile, as the purge hollowed out experience and trust inside the military, one long-standing ambition suddenly appeared far less attainable than Beijing had spent years projecting. For years, China's military messaging revolved around inevitability. Exercises grew larger. Amphibious drills became more complex. Rhetoric hardened. The message was consistent: time was on Beijing's side. Yet the internal crisis exposed by the Jingxi incident has quietly disrupted that narrative, forcing strategists to reassess what China can actually execute and when. If confidence was the foundation of deterrence, what happens when confidence collapses from within? The ambition most directly affected is Taiwan. Any serious move across the Taiwan Strait requires not just hardware but trust in commanders, trust in logistics, trust in the chain of command under extreme pressure. Analysts at Defense News and Military Watch magazine note that large-scale amphibious operations are among the most complex maneuvers in modern warfare. They demand seamless coordination across naval, air, missile, cyber, and space domains. Even minor disruptions can cascade into failure. The recent purge undermines exactly the capabilities such operations depend on. Experienced officers have reportedly been sidelined, planning staffs disrupted, communication protocols rewritten in real time. From a military perspective, this is catastrophic timing. Readiness is not something that can be improvised. Western experts estimate that after a purge of this scale, restoring full-spectrum operational confidence could take several years. Training cycles must restart. Trust must be rebuilt vertically and horizontally. In the meantime, hesitation replaces momentum. This matters far beyond Taipei. NATO officials privately acknowledge that China's internal instability reshapes global strategic calculations. A delayed or weakened Taiwan option reduces immediate escalation risk, but it does not eliminate long-term tension. Instead, it introduces uncertainty, a factor that complicates deterrence planning for the United States and its allies. Donald Trump's administration has already signaled a harder stance on strategic clarity in the Indo-Pacific. Intelligence sharing with regional partners has intensified. Naval deployments are more visible. The message is calibrated: deterrence remains firm, but miscalculation will be met decisively. At the same time, Ukraine's continued strikes on Russian energy infrastructure offer a cautionary parallel. Precision attacks have shown how quickly a modern state's strategic assumptions can unravel. Refineries, export terminals, and power nodes once considered protected are now vulnerable. For Beijing, watching Moscow struggle under sustained energy pressure reinforces an uncomfortable lesson. Wars today are not won by slogans or parades, but by resilience under stress. China's leadership now faces a strategic dilemma. Acting aggressively abroad risks exposing internal weakness. Waiting too long risks signaling decline. Either path carries costs. From Washington's perspective, this pause is both opportunity and warning. Opportunity to strengthen deterrence and alliances. Warning that an internally pressured regime may eventually seek external confrontation to reassert control. Yet as Beijing recalibrated its Taiwan ambitions, the shockwaves of its internal turmoil did not stop at its borders. One ally felt the impact almost immediately. The consequences of Beijing's internal crisis did not remain confined to sealed compounds and silent corridors. Within days, its effects began to surface far beyond China's borders, striking at a partnership that Moscow had come to depend on. What started as a power struggle inside China's military hierarchy quickly evolved into a geopolitical shockwave, one that rippled directly into Russia's war effort. How could a night of chaos in Beijing weaken Russian forces thousands of kilometers away? For years, the China-Russia relationship has been framed as resilient and limitless. In practice, it relied on specific channels, individuals, and logistical arrangements that kept sensitive cooperation discreet but effective. Western analysts now argue that the removal of key Chinese military figures disrupted those channels almost overnight. Supply flows did not stop entirely, but they slowed, fractured, and became politically risky. Open-source intelligence and trade anomaly tracking suggest a sudden decline in shipments of dual-use components, critical to Russia's battlefield endurance. Microelectronics, drone propulsion systems, optics and machine tools, items essential for sustaining Russia's war in Ukraine, showed measurable drops in transit. Reuters and other outlets have repeatedly documented how Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy infrastructure have already strained Moscow's economy. Losing reliable external support compounds that pressure. From the Kremlin's perspective, this is strategic isolation accelerating in real time. Russian forces on the Ukrainian front depend heavily on adaptive supply chains to compensate for sanctions and battlefield losses. Any disruption, even temporary, translates into reduced operational tempo. Tanks without spare parts, drones grounded for lack of components, and degraded communications all carry battlefield consequences. For NATO, the implications are significant. A weakened Russia shifts the balance on the eastern flank, but it also raises escalation risks. As Ukraine continues targeting refineries, fuel depots, and export hubs inside Russia, moves increasingly acknowledged by Western officials as strategically decisive, Moscow's margin for error narrows. A partner distracted by internal fear offers little reassurance. At a broader level, the episode underscores a structural vulnerability shared by centralized regimes. When power concentrates around individuals rather than institutions, alliances become fragile. Remove one node, and the network falters. Western experts increasingly describe this as the authoritarian domino effect, where internal crises cascade outward, weakening entire strategic blocks. For China, the cost is reputational as much as material. A state aspiring to global leadership cannot afford to look unpredictable to allies or adversaries. For Russia, the cost is immediate and tangible, measured in lost momentum on the battlefield and shrinking strategic options. As Beijing continues inward, Moscow is forced outward, more exposed than before. The irony is stark. A system built on absolute control has generated absolute uncertainty, not only at home, but across an entire axis of power. And as the dust settles, one question remains unavoidable: if internal fear can cripple alliances so quickly, what does that mean for the future of authoritarian power in a world defined by pressure, transparency, and relentless conflict?